Hello and welcome to the GC Sunscast. Before we start the episode, I'd just like to thank our Patreon producers for this episode. Old Soul, Jack's Dad, Paul Vosti and James Wood. Without you, we couldn't achieve what we are achieving right now. Now, that brings us into another topic. Last week's episode, I'd like to apologise for the poor audio issues. We received some new tech thanks to our donations from our Patreon producers and struggled with the first week of wiring and connecting it up to the software to run perfectly. It sounded good in our ears, but unfortunately it wasn't the same that was going out live to our audience. So, with apologising for that, we thank you for supporting us, and if you'd like to donate, jump on over to patreon.com/GC Sunscast. Like, follow and subscribe on Facebook, YouTube and SoundCloud and get the word of the GC Sunscast out there. Any more, without further ado, on to the show. Welcome to the GC Sunscast, the only Gold Coast Suns fan show by fans for fans. I'm your host Shane, and joining me as he does every single episode is Tom.
G'day Shane, how are you this week?
Yeah, good. It's good to have some football back, and we've got plenty to talk about tonight. So,
have we ever?
Let's get into it straight away with the news. There's been some big news, but before that, I better set the soundboard for the news. Yes, that will do. So, Tom, tell us what's happening in the AFL Women's.
Yeah, big news today for the Gold Coast Suns. History-making day, really. The inaugural Gold Coast Suns AFLW coach for the next season, 2020, will be a man by the name of David Lake, who I like to call Ricky. I may be the only person in the world who does that. But anyway, David Ricky Lake, maybe we'll call him Brian. David Lake is a very widely respected AFLQ coach. He's coached a couple of premiership sides with a couple of different clubs in the AFLQ, and he's been heavily involved in the Brisbane Lions AFLW side, which has made 2 grand finals in the first 2 seasons, and they're lining up to make finals again this year. He's a midfield coach, and he's also their assistant coach. So he's only making one little step up, and I think he'll be just cracking good for our new team. What do you reckon, Shane?
Yeah, well, hopefully the AFL Women's will start to come on board now that we've got a coach, we've got our first few signings. We'll start to get that flow-on effect with players coming in, and, you know, people that wouldn't normally pay attention to the AFL Women's might start paying attention by the end of the year.
Yeah, well, don't forget the Metricon Stadium was the host of the first AFLW Grand Final, so all we have to do is win a bunch of games and we can host a few more.
Well, speaking of the AFL Women's, Mackay are set to host a Brisbane vs Gold Coast Suns AFL Women's Winter Series game in June this year. And the AFL Queensland, while we're in the top end, has also donated $40,000 to flood relief for those affected up north. Also, another initiative by the Gold Coast Suns is junior club members in local clubs in Townsville and surrounding areas will get free entry into the game against St Kilda on June 15. So the Suns are really getting behind our northern counterparts. Down here in the southeast, we don't hear too much about what goes on up north unless there is something like a flood or some sort of natural disaster. So it's good to get that support up there.
Yeah, my word.
Anyway, let's get into the game. So, the JLT1 kicked off this weekend, and the Gold Coast Suns on Sunday night played the Western Bulldogs up in Mackay. Gold Coast Suns, 11 goals, 11, 77, defeated the Western Bulldogs, 10 goals, 12, 72. Burgess, McPherson, Sexton and Powell each kicked 2 goals. Peter Wright, Jack Bowes and Isaac Rankin had 1 each. So, going into this game, I was excited. You know, first time to see the Suns live. I wasn't able to get to the practice games. But I was also a bit worried. A night game up North Queensland, very slippery, dewy conditions, not ideal to watch slick, good football. But it wasn't a bad result. It was the lowest scoring game of the weekend, and that was due to the conditions, I believe. But we got enough out of it, and we got to see a really good glimpse of the future for Gold Coast Suns.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I want to go on record here as saying it was erroneous of the commentators and a lot of reporters who have said that with Isaac Rankin's first touch that he kicked a goal, he actually was tackled with the ball on the left flank, left wing of the Gold Coast, and he ran about 120 metres to get to where he needed to be to kick that goal, and that's within the first 90 seconds. So he's influenced he's influenced the stoppage, and then he's run back to his position, and as cool as you like, I call it an IZAKERMANIS moment. He's as good as Acker ever was, and it's his first game. He's unreal.
Yeah. Well, Drew said that in the press conference after the game that's just normal for Isaac. Him and a lot of the other players practice those shots all the time at training, and it was just probably good to see it come off during an actual game. And what better way to bring up your first goal in the AFL? Granted, it's still a pre-season game, so I don't think technically it counts. He kicks his first goal in round one. Yeah, the commentators will be up in arms, and the boys will all get around him, patting him on the head. So, but it's a good test run. It's a good test, and just shows what he is capable of. We got a really good glimpse of what Rankin can do.
Yeah,
and
well, Lukosius as well.
Exactly. Straight up after that goal, Lukosius, pinpoint pass to Burgess. It was just an amazing kick, wasn't it?
Yeah, and Lukosius, he didn't look out of place, and he knew where to be and what to do. He's just really cool and calm and collected. And he was managed. They were all managed. The three debutants. That they could have played out the game, and it would have been interesting to see. Maybe we'll see a bit more of them this week.
Yeah, well, there was a bit of concern over King, the other debutant. He didn't touch the ball, but he really struggled to get into the game, and I think that's partly due to who we were playing. The Bulldogs had the smallest forward line going around, and there really wasn't a spot, a place for King in that back line when you had Collins and Thompson there already, as well as Ballard floating in around being a great interceptor. And then they tried to move him forward later in the game, and at that time the Suns' sort of momentum had swung back towards the Bulldogs, and he just happened to be at the wrong end of the ground at the wrong time.
Yeah, in fairness to King, although he largely went unsighted, he did have a few touches. It's just hard to register when a player doesn't have a kick or do anything significant. He had 5 hand passes, 3 of them found a target. Not what he'd call an ideal day out. Particularly given that he's noted for marking, and he's one of the only players in the whole, however many who played, 26 of them, one of the only players who didn't take a mark. So we'll see what happens with him. It was thought that he might be getting close to AFL level, but there were plenty of blokes in his position who did a lot better than him.
Yeah, well, I was really impressed by Sam Collins' performance. I thought Homsch was clearly in front of Collins throughout the pre-season. But after actually watching Collins and watching the way he plays, it genuinely is a flip of the coin as to whether we play with Collins or Homsch. And you'd imagine coming up against a 3 tall forward line, you'd be playing all 3 of them. So it's really going to be unlucky to the player that's going to miss out if we only go with the 2 tall forwards. Tall defenders, sorry.
Yeah. So I knew what you meant. I look at Richmond, and they go with tall defenders no matter who they're playing, and Richmond don't get small until you get to the forward line. No other teams playing with as taller defenders. We've just got really, really big guys. But perhaps you could look at Port Adelaide. They've come out today saying that they'll probably go with 5 giant players above, close to 200 centimetres each. So I think what it really comes down to is, can either Collins or Hobbs take over that kick-in role if Murdoch's general play doesn't sort of meet the standard? Because we did see Murdoch really take advantage of that kick-in with his raking left boot, put it up on the wing, and it wasn't coming back sailing over his head. So what did you think of Murdoch?
I really liked Murdoch. I thought his game was fantastic. I checked the AFL app after the game, and the metres gained for Murdoch was fantastic. It was, I don't think it was quite 500, but it was just below. And I don't recall too many Suns players ever having that sort of an impact.
No, his efficiency was high too.
I think Weller's really good at metres gained, as is Harbrow usually. But yeah, like you said, his disposal efficiency was fantastic. And it was the same with Sam Collins. Sam Collins was our highest disposal efficient player with 91%. So it's just really, really tough for spots in every area of the ground, really.
Absolutely. Look, one of the commentators said that they reckon Sam Collins will be All-Australian in a couple of years. I mean, that's how impressed they were.
Yeah.
And, he was doing the 1%ers, and which other players were doing, but you expect Rory Thompson to not get that many touches, but he gets a bunch of 1%ers. Well, Tomo had 8, and Collins had 7, and normally it's the next player's got 3. So he's done really well there. What a problem to have. We said this last week. I'll say it again. I don't think Stuart Dew even knows what his best 22 is.
No. Well, let's talk about the new rule changes, because we finally got a chance to see what they're going to look like. What did you think? I think the most obvious one was the 666 rule, but also the kick-out rule. And we saw a couple of examples of hands in the back rule where, they've sort of, in the past it would have been a free kick, and this year was a bit more lenient, allowing the player to protect the space. So it really sort of changed the game up, I thought. And you look at every other game besides the Suns game, and there was a team scoring over 100 points.
Yeah, look, I think, I'll go backwards. The point scoring, you're quite right. The conditions weren't conducive to 100 points each. However, the kicking wasn't terribly straight. So, with straighter kicking, we might have seen one or the other team nudge a bit closer to 100. But I thought that, it was fairly evenly weighted. The second quarter, there weren't too many goals scored. But after that, it was pretty free-flowing football. And getting back to the rule changes, that has helped it. If this was under the old rules, it would have been a dour struggle, boring footy. There were lots of stoppages anyway, but there would have been a lot more. I reckon that there are a few good things. To start with the kick-outs that you mentioned. Personally, I really think that this is going to change the way that teams will not be able to lock defensive teams inside their own 50 like there have been. And the Bulldogs are one of those teams, and we were able to get out. And that's going to give us a competitive advantage. Not forgetting the rules apply to both teams, so you find your advantages where you can. Where else did you think that we had the wood on them?
I thought we had the wood on the Bulldogs in the forward line for most of the night. And the defence line, I thought our defence held up really well. Watching the game, I just felt our midfield was... It just didn't look up to par. Our midfield looked like it really struggled. But then again, you pointed out previously that the Dogs' midfield is top notch.
It is, and I mean, you look at the guys in the Bulldogs who got the possessions. You're looking at Jack McRae, who tore us to pieces. Caleb Daniel played out of the back half, but he still got 32 possessions. Lockie Hunter, the Bont, Liberatore, Wallace, McLean, Dunkley. These guys are premiership players. Well, Wallace didn't play in the premiership, but he helped them get there. They aren't the problem with the Dogs, and we still beat them. And that highlights that we can beat a team whilst being beaten in the middle, and because we know from experience they're the type of team that can lose the hit-outs and still win the clearances. So we didn't exactly halve it. They had 45 clearances, we had 40, but I think there were different times of the game where they were on a real roll and really going over the top of us. So I don't know. Do you think that might be just the combinations that we were throwing in the centre?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Looking over after the game, you're able to look at the time on ground stats on the AFL site and now the AFL app as well. And our preferred midfielders were all down the bottom of that. Anthony Miles only had 55% game time, and he's supposed to be one of our primary midfielders. And then the other players, where are the stats? I've got them here. Miles, Ainsworth, Miller, Martin, Weller and Swallow all had less than 67% game time. So as our primary midfielders, for them to play less than 67% it just shows that the coaches were rotating players through, giving other players a chance. I mean, we saw McPherson, Powell and to a lesser extent Lemons and Archie running through that midfield doing really well. Yeah, and then blokes like Fiorini and Ainsworth, I saw them a few times. I didn't think they were fantastic, but they've ended up being our leading disposals. You know,
I kind of put that down to the commentators.
26 or something.
Yeah, Fiorini was one of our better players.
Yeah.
He had a few clangers. I'll have to say, though, the commentators didn't recognise players who'd had haircuts. So Lockie Weller, I don't even remember his name being called out, and he was one of the better players. You've got and Weller does look considerably different. He's more tan. He's got no hair. There was that play in the game where Rankin passed Weller and to Jack Martin, and then Martin kicked it to Powell, and Weller was there in support, but Rankin went past him to Jack Martin, who was in a bit of a better position. I didn't know who the player was in the middle, and it turned out to be Lockie Weller. So I'm with the commentators. Got to do my homework, and I think maybe Fiorini's in that boat too. They just didn't know who he was. They weren't the worst commentators, but yeah, JLT1, they did about as good as that you could expect.
Yeah, and you'd expect come round one, we're going to have a midfield that's going to play 70 to 80% of the game, consisting of Miles, Swallow. Looks like Ainsworth is due for a real role in that midfield from what we've seen.
Yes.
Fiorini as well, and Weller will rotate through there. And have I mentioned Jack Martin? I mean, Jack Martin's definitely going to be in that midfield rotation. So,
yeah,
all those players are really going to come in. And as you've said, we've actually held up pretty well against the Bulldogs midfield. Jared Witts smashed the Dogs in the hitouts, but then again, he was only up against Trengove and English.
And I do think that got away. That was much closer.
Yeah.
And Witsy kind of came to himself. I think he was pretty rusty, and then he really started to dominate in the second half and help us to the win.
Yeah,
but yeah, they were in his face.
I didn't notice Witts having a huge advantage in the ruck. Like he's up there as being one of the best tap ruckmen in the league, but I didn't really see him tapping it to our advantage a lot of the time. But then again, the Suns did win the centre clearances. So
that's right. Yeah,
it was really more around the ground that the Bulldogs were able to beat us, and that was probably when they were able to get their numbers around the ball. And
they were double teaming with, well, not so much double teaming. They English and Trengove both had a lot of time, equal time on the ball, and so when you've got someone who's relatively fresh coming in and you've just had it, because Peter wasn't going too flash in the ruck, so they didn't use him there too much.
No, and he probably had a dirty night, didn't he? He didn't get too much of the ball, but then again, the conditions didn't really suit him. He did take a lot of marks, though, considering the conditions, which I think is very impressive.
He dropped a lot, so people blame him. Or not blame him, they judge him on that. Dropped a lot. He missed a couple of goals. There are things that you would expect that he would do better for the run. And I think he got hyped up a lot, and that can get inside a player's head. But I really hope that they don't use Wright, even though he's a very good ruckman. He didn't have the greatest night in the ruck either. But if they purely use him as a forward, then I think we'll see the best of him. If he's chopping out in the ruck all the time, I think it's too much work. So my preference is to bring...
While we're talking on the team, how did you think the team ran out the game? I was actually quite impressed, and I think I can already see the emphasis that the club has put on the boys during the pre-season as far as running out games and pushing themselves further. You could really see that. They really were able to just... They probably didn't have the same intensity they had at the start, but I don't think it was far off.
Well, look, they were maybe slightly outscored in the final quarter, but they were behind, and then they came back. And that includes from the for kicking the first 4 goals, and then the Dogs come back with 4 more, and suddenly all that really good work in that first quarter when the side was looking much better. And then the Dogs, who hadn't actually had a practice run beforehand, so they were rusty. And then they've come back and they're suddenly winning all the stoppages and looking really good. And then the boys have sort of gone, nah, stuff this. We're going to win this thing. And a few times when you thought that they were going to run out of path for it was, the signs were there that they weren't looking so great, they'd kick a goal and back they'd come. So really happy and really happy with that last 10 minutes. Like Powell kicking a goal, ice cool. It's his second season. He's still a teenager, and he's gone bang. And then Lockie Weller, it was probably the first time I did notice him even playing, instead of banging the goal in, which he could have done from 55. But if the chance was there that it was going to be a behind, and it would have given the Dogs 30 seconds to run up the field. And Burgess taking the mark and missing the goal. I think he might hear from the coach about that one. But that just shows Burgess what he can add, taking those pack marks.
Let's just talk about Burgess for a sec, because I don't really want to go too in depth with all the individual performances. There's a lot to point out, but Burgess is suddenly right in the frame to be our second key forward, or at least maybe push Lukosius out of the side and be that third tall forward if we go with 3 talls. He looks really good. He's got strong hands, and he certainly knows how to kick a goal, and he can get into a good position.
Yeah. Isn't it a good problem to have? I keep saying that. Look, he should have had 3 goals. One of his kicks at goal was a disaster. So two kicks he'd rather have back. But his disposal efficiency was pretty good. He's taken a bunch of marks. Didn't end up having all that many possessions, but the possessions that he did have, I thought he showed really good quality at ground level. Because if it had hit the deck, he was one of the first guys down around his ankles trying to get it back again, and that's impressive.
Yeah. Let's see. Let's look at some of these other individual performances. McPherson was fantastic. I reckon a lot of people might have looked at us a bit weird when we put our Facebook poll up for a defensive forward, and it was a choice between Lemons and McPherson, I think. Because a lot of people probably were trying to cram, when they were doing their best 22, I reckon they were all trying to cram your blokes like Ainsworth, Archie, Aaron Young, Isaac Rankin, Jack Lukosius, they're all trying to cram all this firepower that we've got into the forward line. And I reckon a lot of people would have forgotten about McPherson, especially considering he did his knee last year and spent a lot of time out. But he's just come back the way he was playing early last year before he hurt his knee.
Yeah.
He was all over the ground applying that real strong defensive pressure, and he always bobbed up when we needed him to kick a goal.
Well, that's where the side was winning games last year. Was even if we'd turn the ball over in forward 50, we'd harass and harass and harass, and it turns into goals. And you could say any player who influenced a goal was the difference between the two teams, but without McPherson, we lose this game. And, his stats don't look especially great, but his pressure was just fantastic. And I think the next player we're going to talk about is Lemons, because he was there as well. The pair of them were just terrorising the big defenders from the Bulldogs, and they forced a couple of turnovers that ended up being Suns goals. So, that's that. You can't pick a side without taking that kind of thing into consideration. And I think that's what Stuart Dew was showing us last year.
Yeah. I've just got Jiri Stiller in the chat reminding us that McPherson did his fibula, not his knee, last year. So,
yes, true. And we were smashing the Lions at the time, and then we nearly lost the game after he went off. So he really did. It really was, in my mind, the turning point of the season, because without his forward pressure. But he did well enough to get back for the final NEFL game last year. So, he's had a full off-season, so we shouldn't be surprised to see him up there. Disposal efficiency would be something he'd like to work on, but small forwards are really known for their accuracy, so they've got to take the risks, I guess. He had a left-foot snap, which, if it had turned out to be a goal, would have been brilliant. So, that counts towards it, I guess.
Do you have anything else to say about Rankin or Lukosius, or have we pretty much covered those guys?
Reckon we've covered those two guys. I think.
Right.
I think just the one word to say on them is that they are better than your average top draft picks, because it was a really good draft, and so it's just so exciting to see what they're going to do.
Yeah, so you think they'll both make round one?
It's hard because there are so many key position players in the running, and we had one of our listeners say that he didn't think Peter Wright should be in the best 22. I disagree, but it's got to be an option at the selection table. If he has another dirty night next week, well, do they just hope that he gets better in round one, or do they play with the hot hand?
Yeah, so, it's a lot of question. A lot of people go different ways. A lot of people are saying, we should be putting all our young superstars in and get as many games into them as possible. And then other people,
plenty of time for that,
going for a more
season.
balanced. Other people going for a more balanced response team. It's to sort of shelter these young boys, not gift them games, and teach them how to play football. So it's really horses for courses. The coaching staff will make all those decisions. I certainly think Rankin's pretty much guaranteed a spot. Lukosius, I think, will have to fight for his, because certainly Burgess, Day, Wright, and even Charlie Ballard is in the same sort of mould, are all really, upping their game and pushing Lukosius to have to really show what he can do early. The other bloke I want to mention is Will Powell. Didn't he look good?
Yeah, I mean, regardless of whether he's going to be in their side in round one, and a tip to those who read the player profiles, he's my next feature. He compared to he wouldn't have made the team last year if it weren't for all those injuries, right? And he didn't do a hell of a lot to keep himself in the team, but there was no one else. But now he looks like a contender, doesn't he? Like, I'd have him on the fringe of my 26. Whether he'd get into the 22 for round one, I don't know. But, yeah, he was terrific and cold as ice, taking the goal that essentially won us the match.
Yeah. So, I was really impressed by Powell. He's certainly come a long way from last year, and I I think he's got the ability to be just as good as at least what Jack Martin's lived up to so far. So, yeah, Will Powell looks like he's got everything. Just needs a bit more game time and a bit more development and growth. He should be an
a few more potatoes
player for us, yeah. All right,
more
there
carbs.
were a couple of injuries that came out of that game. We had George Holland-Smith rolled his ankle early in the game, but he did return and play out the game. So it shouldn't be too much of an issue there. Maybe just a little bit of rest if it flared up afterwards. And the main loss was Sean Lemons had a Bulldogs player roll onto his ankle near the end of that game. So it was actually just after he'd set Powell up for that goal to put us in front. Yeah, it looks like Lemons could be out for a bit of time. We're still waiting on scans from the club. It was delayed. Usually we'd know by now, but it looks like it's been delayed due to a community camp. At least that's what Jerry Still is telling me on the chat. So, yeah, hopefully we'll find some more news out tomorrow. And hopefully it's not too bad for Lemons.
Look, I think in an AFL match, you got plenty of opportunities for players to play through injury if it's managed properly. But, is it worth it to risk them for a JLT match? So, let George and Shawnee have a week off. Unfortunately for Sean, if it is a couple of weeks, then, back to the NAFL, mate. Yep. But he played really well.
Yeah, he did. All right, well, that does it for the JLT wrap-up. We've got about 10 minutes to chat about our midfield. So the midfield depth, this follows on from the defence depth and the forward line depth we've done over the last couple of episodes. The midfield depth hasn't changed as much as the other positions because we haven't lost a superstar player. The only one that I can think of that we had lost was Lyons. Was there anyone else that was a regular 22 in our midfield that we lost over the off season?
No, we didn't. We didn't lose a lot of mids. That wasn't really a problem for us. We, if anything, we're pretty blessed for mids. We had a few injuries in the midfield towards the end of last year. For example, Jack Martin didn't play the end of the year. And players who were increasingly playing more midfield, like Ainsworth and Bowes, they were playing in the midfield on the weekend. So, Weller's another guy who wasn't playing in midfield, but now he is. So we're going to have some selection dilemmas, funnily enough, in the mids as well as in the forwards and backs.
Yeah, we are going to have a lot of dilemmas because we brought in Miles, George Holland-Smith, and Corey Ellis would be playing a midfield role. You could probably argue Murdoch as well, but I think it's pretty evident that his spot's going to be in defence for the majority of this year. I think the improvement for this year isn't going to come from the boys that we've brought in. I mean, Miles is certainly, in my eyes, an improvement over Lyons. They are slightly different players, as much as people will say they're the same. Lyons was a very aggressive, offensive footballer. A lot of the time he'd grab the ball and just kick it, get it out. That was his job to clearance. And then around forward, down in front of goals, he had that forward craft and was able to kick goals quite easy. I haven't seen Miles show that forward craft yet, and that's including his time when he was at Richmond. But he does pay more attention to where he's putting the ball, and I think he's got a bit more disposal skill than what Lyons had. There was one moment in the JLT game where Miles grabbed the ball from a clearance, and where Lyons would usually blaze away and have a shot at goal, Miles looked up, spotted a Suns player, I can't remember who it was now, and hit them. And that Suns player then went back and had a shot at goal. I think the Suns player ended up missing the goal, but the point was Miles had the foresight to lower his eyes and look for a target. Now, I don't think Lyons showed that too often in his time at the Suns. So I'm really buoyed by Miles. I think he's going to improve the side. George Holland-Smith is going to improve it from a leadership perspective, you would think. Not sure if he'll bring much more improvements for the whole team any other way. But our improvement's going to come from boys like Ainsworth, Bowes, Fiorini, Weller, Powell, Brodie, Dawson, Shear, Ellis, those sorts of boys. What do you think about those names?
Yeah, look, if I'm gonna name some guys who are definitely in there, it's your Swallow, Martin, and Miller. They're to me, they just pick themselves. In today's poll, you've got Swallow up against Brodie, and I'll confess to be the only person who picked Brodie because someone had to. And it's nothing against Brodie, and we'll talk about him in a bit more detail after, but those are your three main guys. So when it comes to who's going to complement them, George Holland-Smith being injured, I've seen him play for Geelong before, and he didn't really stand out because they've got so many standouts. I hope Brad Shear gets a go because he's been a big improver for us. I hope Will Brodie gets a go. But yeah, as far as the new guys in the midfield, Miles for me is the only one who is a top 22 player out of those two guys that you mentioned. But yeah, look, Bowes, Powell, Weller, I consider would be a midfielder now, and of course Fiorini. Well, which ones do you pick? You got to leave some of them out. You can't have. You can
it's
pick.
Really tough when you then add in the mainstays like Took and Swallow. But I think you've got Took and Swallow. They're our hard at it midfielders. Swallow's sort of he doesn't really have the breakaway pace that he used to. So I think they're going to be our more in and under sort of players. Add Miles to that list for the rotations. And then the other mids are going to be impact players. We're going to want Ainsworth in there if he's not down forward. He's shown a lot in the practice matches. So, and in that 5-game stretch last year, Ainsworth just killed them. Now, Bowes has also improved quite a bit in the off-season and looks like he's ready for that midfield time, so that should be good. And Fiorini, we saw what he can do in half a game of football in the JLT. Because at half-time he had next to no disposals. I think it might have been about 4. And he's finished as our highest disposal getter. So he can certainly rack them up and make good decisions with the ball. And then I think Powell, if Powell gets a game, he's going to have an impact in our midfield, I think. He may be more of a winger, but he certainly knows how to get the ball. He's calm and composed when he has it. And, yeah. Now, my biggest concern is Brodie. He wasn't cited in the JLT1. He did have a good finish to the season last year, but we haven't seen much of him at all in the preseason. Reports came out last week after the game versus Brisbane. Brodie played half a game there and didn't have too much of an impact, but he was running laps and looked like he was struggling fitness-wise after the game. So it's real concerns. If Brodie doesn't play this week, we've really got to question whether he is best 22. And if he isn't, then what's going on there? Because he was a top 10 draft pick a couple of years ago, and all the other top 10s, with the exception of Scrimshaw, have all come on.
Look, I think Scrimshaw's a different case because he was more picked for his potential and not for his body of work. Whereas Will Brodie, he was one of the there's certain points in the before the draft he was touted as possibly being a number one pick. So he's been a very impressive player as a junior. Didn't get as many games as he might have thought he would have gotten in his first season, but you can't really just chuck 4 young blokes in the middle and hope they'll go that well. And they had Brad Shear to blood as well. You possibly even say Shear is ahead of Brodie development wise, even though Brodie did bust out and have a couple of good games. But I don't know. I mean, there's conspiracy theories that he's fallen out with coaches and this and that. just take it all with a grain of salt. We'll see. We'll see if he's not fit, and whether that's due to injury or he just hasn't come through the program, in as well. I mean, he's still a very young man. I don't know. I can't really. It would be really. I couldn't even think of any player who has had some sort of controversy in the preseason with their coach, and then whatever. So I refuse to believe that. I just hope that he gets a go, whether it's in the JLT2 or they'll no doubt have a couple of NEFL practice matches, and he'll play AFL footy this year. There's no doubt about it, because he's a great player. But there's just so many other guys putting their hand up. It's really hard to pick how many players and what mix you go with on the bench, and they're gonna have trouble picking 26 and then naming 4 emergencies.
Yeah, look, Brodie's an interesting case. He's got the talent. There's obviously something keeping him out of the side. At the moment, I don't think that's a bad thing. He's either not up to the AFL standard, which you wouldn't think is the case. We've seen him perform at the level in the last couple of years. So it's going to be a case of either he's not getting along with people at the club, he doesn't buy in, or quite simply, and more likely scenario, he's struggling fitness-wise. And, there are other players at the club that are ahead of him. As we've just listed off a whole bunch of mids, it's going to be really tough to get all these players into the same side. Only 22 players can take to the field, So
yeah.
it's just not going to be a case. There's going to be someone missing out every week, and you see that in all the good teams. All right, well, We're almost out of time, so we'll have to leave it there. I'm sure we'll talk about the midfield in coming episodes, because it's going to be such a hot topic. But before we go, we'll go through our listener questions. Jerry Stiller on the chat has asked, as third tall, Ballard or Joyce or Collins against St Kilda? So he's obviously asking, like, in our fairness, in our defensive line for our fan voted GC Sunscast side, we had Joyce sitting there, but you got to question now whether Collins or Ballard get in, because that's probably the likely spot they're going to take.
Yeah, but you did say horses for courses. No, I'm not convinced that Ballard is in the back six, not because of his game. I mean, he did a couple of silly things, but he did a lot of good things. He wasn't as good as Collins, but you'd expect that Collins, with his age and experience, would be trying to sort of, put down a good first game to make the impression. And whereas Ballard's already accepted as a senior player, and whether he's best 22 or not is, he's fringe. But Jesse Joyce is an incumbent. He plays a role. If I don't know if it's Joyce or if it's Murdoch that should be under question here, because Murdoch's just come in and, he did some great things, but Jesse just played a really solid game, didn't make a single mistake, and how can you can't really judge him on that, but it's just tough. I think horses for courses, they'll end up being a team where Joyce just doesn't have a matchup and he gets stuck on the emergency list. And they'll end up being a game where we just can't carry 3 talls. I think Ballard's a winger, and I think Collins for the third tall in defence.
Yeah, I think that's about it. I mean, Joyce is more of a small defender. Locked down on those small defensive players. We don't really have anyone else capable of doing that role. Harbrow and Murdoch aren't as defensive-minded as you need for something like that. And I'm pretty sure St Kilda do have a dangerous small forward that could really hurt us if we don't have someone on him. So I think Joyce still maintains his position, or at least is in the best 22. All right,
I wouldn't mind Tuke Miller going back and tagging a dangerous, like someone like an Eddie Betts.
Yeah, we could see that happening in the future. Well, that's it for now. We're running out of time. So this episode seems to have gone off without a hitch. We'd like to thank our Patreon supporters again. Remember, you can support us on Patreon over at GC Sunscast, at patreon.com/GC Sunscast. But for now, that's the end of the show. Thanks for joining me, Tom, and go Suns.
Thanks, Shane. Go Suns.